visiting artist talk today. I was talking with Adam over lunch about the wonders of the internet and how friendly it is to representational painting, and how difficult it used to be for representational painters to connect. I started on Facebook about 3 years ago, discovered not too long after the work of this young Brooklyn painter. I thought it's pretty good. And then got to know him a little bit online through cross comments and those sort of things. About a year ago, saw some of his work posted again, and I thought, God, this guy's gotten really good. Really amazing work. Adam has a great story. I don't know how much of his life he's going to tell you about, hopefully some of it. He didn't finish high school. He went off at the age of 16 to Florence, Italy, and studied at the Florence Academy of Art, I believe it's called.
Yeah. Florence Academy, Michael John Age.
And it's just an amazing thing, I think, at that age, to know what you're going to do, to take off, go to Europe by yourself, and do that. So he's an amazing artist, amazing person. Please welcome Adam Miller.
So thanks for coming out. So I'm not going to talk so much about the work itself today because it's a school setting. So I thought it'd be a great idea to talk more about how I actually come up with the ideas and how I make the work practically. And that probably will give a little more insight anyway into what it's all about in the end. So I was going to start with the basic idea behind my work here. I wanted to show you a couple of images and begin with a little excerpt from Oscar Wilde. And it's from The Decay of Lying, which I think kind of expresses a lot of what I'm trying to do with the work. And he says, people have a careless way of talking about a born liar, just as they talk about a born poet. But in both cases, they're wrong. Lying and poetry are arts. Arts, as Plato saw, not unconnected with each other, and they require the most careful study, the most disinterested devotion. Indeed, they have their technique. Just as the more material arts of painting and sculpture have their subtle secrets of form and color, their craft mysteries, their deliberate artistic methods, as one knows the poet by his fine music, so one can recognize the liar by his rich rhythmic utterance. And in neither case will the casual inspiration of the moment suffice. So that's kind of the idea behind my paintings, in that I've always been interested in creating another world that I can take people into that's just a little bit different than this one. And painting never really realism was never really a goal for me. So I use it as a technique to try to convey a story and to make you believe the lie that I'm telling you, that this can actually exist. So when I first kind of discovered this, I started off and I was really inspired by various Renaissance paintings. And I went through a very frustrating period where I was trying to discover, like, how do I create this world, which I'll show you in a couple of paintings now. This is one that's called Twilight in Arcadia. And, well, it's twilight because the hunters are walking into this like beautiful pastoral setting, finding beautiful mythological creatures and just hunting them down and killing them. And another one in the same series here is called The Roses Never Bloomed So Red, which is a continuation of the theme. And the third one, I'm going to work through these pretty quickly so I can get more into the technical backdrop here. This is called Apparition. The story, again, somewhat self-evident. There's two hunters who have found a woman digging through the trash. One of them sees beauty, one of them sees a pest. And it's my own kind of comment on the role of beauty in a technological society. So moving on to the last one, this painting is called Into the Wild. So from here now, I'm going to jump back a little bit and talk about how I came to make these paintings. So when I first started off, I was really interested in comic books and illustration. And there was something about them that they were formal, they were geometric, and they had a lot of imagination. So I grew up in Portland, Oregon, and one of my early influences, believe it or not, was Will Vinton Studios. which had a studio in Portland, Oregon, and a lot of the people that I grew up with were actually working with them. So to give you just a little taste of my early inspiration, well, this is an illustration from the same period, Frank Frazetta, when I wanted to be a comic book artist. And so I brought this in, Frank Frazetta, and here from Will Vinton Studios, to give you kind of the expressive and comic background of my work. That sort of set me down the path of discovering the old masters, which really, it tied together for me, you know, this idea that I was going to create a world for you and make you believe it even though it wasn't really real. So jumping into this, this was a piece that inspired me when I was probably 13 years old. I discovered Michelangelo's work, and I saw everything that I had been trying to say through doing comics, through illustration, through American popular culture, wrapped up in this one piece. The drama, the dynamism, the mythology, all kind of came together here. And when I saw this, this set me down my path that I've followed ever since. So the next piece here is a piece by Rubens, which was another really early influence on me, and it ties back together with the Frank Frazetta, where I suddenly discovered that in this language of the old masters, I had to find that. I had to find the larger-than-life, over-the-top, heroic characters that were going to populate my worlds, so I could say things that they would start to feel ridiculous if you looked at them through the lens of realism. I think the world of art is a world that's larger than life, and to the degree that we can communicate that, we can actually take people into like the darker, more universal aspects of what it is to be a human being, and they can look at it, they'll accept it, they'll come along for the ride, and we can kind of reveal more of ourselves that way. So this is all kind of the background of where I'm coming to now when I'm doing my work. And what I wanted to do with this lecture is kind of save people steps along the way. I've met a lot of students today who are really fantastic, talented painters. And so I'm going to go through the things that if somebody had told me a long time ago, I think I would have understood much more of where I'm trying to go today. And it could have saved me like 8 years of frustration. So there's some tools that I use in my work. And I'm going to go into them here. Give me just a second. Okay, so the first thing that I think is really important for an artist is to solidify your idea of like what is your style and vision, which can be surprisingly difficult. So going back to my ideas coming from comics and illustration and developing through the old masters, I couldn't quite figure out how to get that. I would do a painting, I would pose a model, I would set them up in the studio, and it would be very realistic, and it would just fall completely flat for me. There was no soul. So I started to figure this out and say, how am I going to bring this to life? And a couple of the tools that I used that I found were really important is predominantly, first of all, proportion. So when I paint a painting like this, and you see a figure who, this was inspired by Raphael's Saint Michael and the Dragon, and it's a over-the-top mythological kind of Christian piece in the past, and I wanted to adapt this into the world of American mythology and empire. And so the first thing that sticks out is this pose is just ridiculous. Like if anybody was actually trying to kill a satyr or a dragon or anything and they were dancing like they're in the Bolshoi ballet, you would just find that to be the silliest damn thing that ever happened. So the tool I use is proportion. The figures are not anywhere near natural kind of bodies. I looked back to the old masters and I saw the way Michelangelo could make you accept the craziest contortions and the most extreme emotion, and he did this by making your figures larger than life. And so I discovered this as a tool that the human being is actually a malleable concept in art, and how you form it and how you shape it is going to actually express what you are as a painter. What I was really interested in playing with was the idea of a stage. The kind of metaphorical idea that all of life is a theater and we're actors playing in it, which again is a tool that allows me to present a situation to you that might be somewhat absurd and might be somewhat unappealing if you were to look at it as a literal thing, but the formal values of the painting really do carry you along, and I think you're able to accept the absurdity of the situation as this satyr is falling down, and in reference to the Vietnam War protests, picking flowers up and sticking them into the gun, at the same time as this other family of satyrs is hiding out in the back and the dog is sniffing his ass. Like, all of this comes together into a situation that, taken out of context, you're just gonna go, the hell is this guy up to? So coming back to this idea of like illusion and lying, that's a big part of this. And on a side note, I actually had 2 dogs having sex in the beginning, and I took them out because I think it just took over the painting. And the other tool that I took from some of the old paintings that I looked at was the use of light and shadow. And the way the cast shadows create areas of dark that create the illusion that these forms overlap each other and actually make it more sculptural. So I'm able to design in a very narrow, shallow space and yet give you the feel that it's actually much deeper than it is. Again, all in my attempt to make you believe this completely fabricated deception that I've put together. So, moving on here. This is another tool of realism that I thought was actually really important to me, and I think makes the whole painting come together, is the degree of finish and detail, which looks a little bit better here. This head is blown up huge now, so it actually doesn't look all that finished, but just bear with me. So that's another part, is I've created these human beings that, I mean, to me, they're really, like, the satyr is a manifestation to me of what it is to be a natural human. He hasn't been structured. He's not part of society yet. He's not following the rules. And the hunters are this aspect of society that just simply wants to crush and grind this under the wheels of efficiency. And so when I did this, I wanted to bring this beautiful, soft finish to him, again, to pull you in and make you connect with him, because the figure himself is constructed into strange proportions and becomes somewhat otherworldly. And this is another tool. So for people that aren't artists, I hope you don't get too bored, but I'm going to go into a lot of technical stuff here. When I was working, again, part of like the art of creating your own figures and creating your own paintings in general, I think, is knowing where you have to stick to the truth and where you don't. So I put this detail up to show the wrist, really, of all things, because there's certain parts of the human being and certain parts of a narrative even that have to be right. And they're usually the parts that don't bend. So metaphorically speaking, the joints are the key to the whole painting. So when I tend to paint a figure, I'll articulate certain areas fully and completely to where you can now accept it and move on, and I'm free to take you where I want you to go in the rest. So I'll build a series of lines and architecture through my painting, which your eye will follow along, and you'll believe that they're real, more or less, if I'm successful, because the joints will be so articulated and so rendered, which is a tool that I took from sculpture. So another thing that happened in this painting that, another thing that I use oftentimes, again, is I love the idea of composing on a bas-relief, because it's very shallow space and it's very architectural, and there's a stability to that structure again. So I'm always playing with ideas of edges, pushing things back, softness against sharpness. So the butterfly and the finger will come towards you, and the background will fade into softness, which allows, as a painter, it allows you to create a world that can be absolutely focused on the key essential part of the narrative, and you can kind of let the rest go away and not be distracting. So let me move on here. So anyway, before I move on, well, I'll show you one more picture here. I'll go back here. So that's part of, basically that's part of what I want to get across as to the students as an artist. There's so many absurdities here. You look at the background and you see the light source. The sun is setting behind them in the distance, and yet they're lit by a light in front of them too. Like, I think this is what, as students, painters should really take in, is that you don't have to follow any of these rules. You're completely free to build a reality, and there's things you can do to smooth that process over and get away with it. So now moving on, one of the interesting things about composition is, where I got a lot of my ideas was from a book called Erasmus, or an author, Erasmus, wrote a book called De Copia. And in this book, he said the key to composition in a particular style, if you want to make your work read, is to learn everything that's been done before and to essentially make a copybook. So he would take, medieval monks would memorize many different passages from poems, and they would recombine them into new poems. And so this was always a place, as an artist that likes to quote other artists, I found to be very interesting. So I've got a couple of examples here just showing historically how that's been done. So much of what we think of as originality and new compositions are surprisingly paste-ups from other people's work. So a few key examples I wanted to show here. This is the first one, which is the creation of Adam from Michelangelo, which was an interesting composition that was seen as revolutionary and transforming painting. And yet at the same time, what it was he had a copybook in his mind of a lot of his favorite pieces that had existed in history, and he would recombine them to make his own compositions, which is something that I would encourage all of the students to do as you're working, is find those images that really appeal to you on some level that for whatever reason you can't even figure out, they just excite you. And take notes and keep them, because you can use those as raw materials, as even here, the most famous painting in the world. And if we switch to the next image, you see the same figure of God reused in the next panel of the same ceiling. So this is really, I think, what it is to be a creative artist, is you're taking influences from the past, from the present, and you're recombining those through your own vision into making a new painting that has never existed before. And I'll give you just a few more examples of how that works. Here's a Rubens. And he's taken a statue of an old fisherman. He's made a drawing of it, and he's recombined it with a bunch of figures and turned it into a painting. So this is something that I think, as a figure painter with such a rich history behind you, it's crazy to ignore, is you want to look back and see what other artists have done before you. Here's another one of Rubens with another statue, transforming it. And here's, of course, a famous example of a more modern painter doing exactly the same thing. So this is one of mine. The next step in terms of developing your ideas that I love to do is to make collages, where I'll sit, have a drink, maybe smoke something, you know, it all varies. And I'll just surf the internet, this great kind of worldwide collection of junk and beautiful things that we have out there, and just start pasting things together. And I come up with a lot of my ideas that way, because as a painter, we're visual people. We can talk about it, we can have a concept, but I don't think that really translates into a powerful image. And by switching into collages, I'm able to get an image that I don't quite understand necessarily, but it speaks to me. So this is one of mine, and that's usually where I start my work. And once I've got this done, I'll start to go in and actually flesh out my painting, which I'll show you a bit about here. So here's another example. This is a painting by Gian Domenico Tiepolo, who is the son of the famous Tiepolo. And I saw this painting, and again, I just looked at it and I went, something is happening here. Don't know what it is at first, but I'm really liking it. So I use this as the basis to develop my own composition, which is the first painting you see in the beginning, Twilight in Arcadia with the Hunters. So my next step was looking at the old masters and reading about how they developed these paintings and finding myself in a situation of wanting to do the same thing. I read all about their sculptures. Many, like Rubens and Tintoretto, would not be painting from life. They would actually paint from constructed realities of clay. And these days, we have computers that can do the same thing. So I made this really gawky, awkward poser 3D model that just looks like something from Deliverance. But the dog's doing mushrooms again. I don't know what's going on down there. But again, it was just a way for me to become visual. Like, I found that was the most important thing of my process. I didn't want to get bogged down in language. I wanted to keep myself in my right hemisphere and make an image that I found compelling. So I made this, for better or worse. And once I had this done, grand inspiration, The next step was to start to flesh this composition out. So I got models in and I started taking photographs of them. And again, going back to my idea that a figure in a painting should never really be, in my world, realistic. Because the drama that I'm asking you to partake in is so bizarre that you'll never accept it if the people are real. And plus, I want my own manifestation of my own view. I feel like that's what motivates me as a painter. And that's probably what motivates a lot of people to paint as opposed to be a photographer, is what we can do that's separate from reality. So I have a lot of pictures I could show you of reference, but they're nude and they're videotaping this, and the models don't want to be online, so I'll keep it brief. Here's another one, which is the picture of the hunter in the back who's standing up in the center. So, giving you an idea about my process here. This is the painter Billy Norby, by the way, who just had a show at Corey Helford, in case anybody's interested. This is me trying to pose the dog with Billy Norby. So, you know, it doesn't always work out, but you do the best you can. Yeah. This is me trying to pose a duck. So this was another one of the things that I decided, I'll just flip past that, that's pretty ugly. When I did these paintings is, in order to make this believable, I was going to do a revolution here in my own art. Nothing was going to get into this painting that hadn't been thought about, researched, composed, oil sketched, drawn, thought through, and it led me down absurdities like going down the street to a slaughterhouse to get a duck that I tried to pose and it didn't work out at all, and it stunk. So the next step along the way is I've got my photo reference, I've got my ideas, I've made my crappy poser models, and I'm starting to think, okay, now when does this become a painting? So I do one of these. I always make an oil sketch because it allows me to now enter the world of actual oil painting where the decisions I'm making are about underpainting, which in this case is brown, about glazing, about creating a color harmony, and all those things that if somebody as a painter just goes directly to photography and tries to transfer that into a painting, you're not going to make your own world. So this is, I think, a really important stage, and I talked to a couple of the students about that today, how key it is to do this along the way. And here's another one, which is a painting that I actually just finished up and don't have a photograph of, but showing you it's my first thoughts about what these paintings are going to become. So once I have all of that, I've got my ideas and my reference collected together, I start drawing on the canvas. And now we're coming back to Twilight in Arcadia, and this is the very beginning stage where I took charcoal on my huge canvas. It was about 8.5 feet, so it was probably from here to about over here. And I just started essentially putting skeleton people onto the canvas. I would find their joints and find their bones and mark them in where they were going to sit in space. And once I had all that and I was sure of the proportions and things were fitting, it would start to turn into sculpture, essentially. I would go onto those bones that I had constructed and start to hang flesh on it. And so that I did probably more than I thought I had to do, but I wanted to be totally sure of everything. So this is the drawing about halfway through. You can see it developing. The Saturn's starting to look there. It looks like he has gas still. I fixed that later. Yeah, so this is moving along here. And this is the next step. I've actually kind of skipped a step to jump to the next step. So when that was done, I worked over the whole painting to create a sort of a monochrome wash that would put the whole thing back into atmosphere. And I started building up white highlights on it. And the reason I did this is it allowed me to keep it very clean and strong and simple. I always think with a painting, you want to start with the most forceful, clear image and let chaos come in down the road, because it always does. Like, I think one of the things about makes good art good is the artist starts with a very clear cut visual idea, and chaos, like in all things in life, just comes in and tries to take over. So by doing this, it also allowed me to build up some textures as I started to work up the light parts of the painting. Here it is, taken just a little bit farther, where again, in an effort to keep things strong and simple, once I had the whites built in, I started to develop dark washes almost like a watercolor, to flesh out my imagery and to decide where are my dark masses of the composition going to go to guide the way the viewer saw the painting. This is a close-up. So you can see at this point, it's still a little rough, it's not perfect, but I pretty much know everything that's going to happen here. All of my real decisions have been made. So when I do start to put color onto it, I can actually leave some of this thin paint coming through and create a really rich multi-surface kind of layer from the drawing even showing through in a few spots, washes of color, opaque highlights, thin glazes, and like thick color later on. And here's another one, which you saw the oil sketch for earlier, of the man stealing the fish. So this is done exactly the same way, but a little more polished. It's a smaller painting. And you can see I'm just starting to work color throughout the background and over the big giant fish here. So that kind of takes you into the next step where I'm actually going to finish these paintings. And here's another painting. This is The Roses Never Bloom So Red. And this is just to show part of the reason that I have to do all this planning is when you do start to paint, there's nothing worse than getting really crappy paint quality and muddy colors. So this allows me to just go in and not make mistakes, theoretically, at least not that I'll talk about here. So I basically can keep my colors fresh, I can keep them vibrant, and I think that's another thing that as students going forward painting, you really want to be sure about is when you're painting, you want to paint. You want to just get it right, get it perfect, and not have to go and explain to people like, you know, I almost got it, but I didn't quite get it, but it's pretty good anyway. So here's the process there. And this is the finished painting at this point developed. And you can see still some of the shadows showing through on the arm and the kind of final established image in which I wasn't looking at my photo references much except for detail. I was coming back to my initial conception in the color sketch to make that work. So that's a little bit about the way that I work and what I do. Does anybody have any questions at all about the process there?
Do you have a mixed palette?
No, not at all. I started off with a huge palette because I really wanted to. When I first started painting, I was very free-formed about it. I'd learned from some painters who didn't really seem to have a lot of order. And in fact, they were just older. So they'd already kind of internalized their order a long time ago. So I tried to paint in this sort of world of like shots of whiskey and throwing the canvas and like just like something out of a bad Hollywood movie. And it just never quite worked for me. So I almost had a sort of religious conversion after a point where I realized like the art that I'm most inspired by has something stable and almost like, to not be corny here, but eternal about it. It's like you look at that piece and you say, that's just right. So coming back to the color, I simplified my palette for a long time after that in an effort to kind of find order. And then I think as like an artist, you're in this constant growing process of finding order and losing order and finding order and losing order. And so then eventually I opened my palette up a lot. And now if you look at the flesh, I mean, and you see it doesn't show so well here on the slide, but there's greens, there's violets, there's like, I think because there's a language to paint and color that I like to push as far as I possibly can, you know? So it becomes more fleshy than real flesh in a sense, and you look at that arm, and hopefully in person you feel like you can like grab it and hold it. And because of that, it gets a tactile value that takes it beyond a vision. It becomes a stable object, almost like an icon that you can continue to look at for a long period of time.
Yeah, you have three processes, so you have your, well, you really have more than that, but you know, in terms of the painting itself, you do your underdrawings. If it's your dealer, it's okay. Yeah. So you do your underdrawing, and then you do an underpainting, and then you do your overpainting. Are those about the same length of time, or is one long?
You know, it varies a lot. On this painting, which I feel like as an artist, I'm the most successful with the painting when it, when it reads clearly. When you look at it and the foundation visually is so strong that you almost can't deny it, which is the case with this painting. And so I spent longer on the drawing for this painting, actually, because once I had it, and the design was so simple and so clean that it almost painted, it was so logical in a way that it just painted itself. And there's other paintings which I won't entirely mention, but there's struggles. Like, I find it's all in the foundation. If the foundation comes together beautifully and there's something powerful about the idea, and the color even has to have an idea behind it that brings it to life, it paints itself. If you as an artist are not sure going into a piece sometimes what you're trying to accomplish with it, I think it tends to lead to a lot of repainting and reworking. And let me actually jump back here to the beginning, and I'll show you. This one fell right in the middle, because I had a pretty strong idea what I wanted to do with this painting, but it was so hard to balance all these elements and still keep the psychology of the painting what I wanted it to be. Like, I didn't want it to be a conglomeration of details, but there was so much in the world. So as a painter, I do a lot of editing, like making sure you're not looking where I don't want you to look, and making sure you are looking where I do want you to look, so the story of what's important kind of unfolds in front of you.
I have a question. Can you talk a little bit more about your process when you're deciding how to light your forms and paint the light on your forms? Because I know you're shooting different photo references.
Yeah,
the lighting is really different, so you're getting this really, I know you've got like a lot of different unknown light sources happening, but your forms are all really beautifully lit and very consistent. Are you using references when you're painting that, or is that just your knowledge of, because you've done it for so long?
It's a little of both, you know. Like, typically I start with a vision, almost like a stage set. And just like with a stage set, I figure I can have like spotlights, I can have light bouncing in from the side. And so in this painting, for instance, because it's such a dark scene, and when you actually think about it, it's kind of strange what's going on, I wanted to make it so inviting. So as the figures came into the middle of the painting, their shadows became filled with extra light. So there wasn't, in a sense, there wasn't the psychological darkness to complement the narrative darkness. And as it moved out to the side, I let the darkness and the danger creep back into the painting. So when I set that up, it was a little bit of both. I actually did make sure when I put my model there, I had light bouncing in from the side to fill in the shadows. But it wasn't this extreme. Like, remember, I actually showed a picture of the sleeve, and it was quite a bit darker than that. So part of what I wanted to do here was I let the colors become very saturated in the sleeve, so it would fool you. Like, you wouldn't see, like, say that sleeve looks flat. You would look at it and just say, ah, it looks luminous and it looks vibrant, and I'll accept it and move on because the colors are glowing in the shadows. So there's a lot of adjustments, which is where the sketch comes in and is so important, to where you work into the language of painting and what painting can do, that I really do think is different than photography. And I think it, as a classical painter, of course, I think photography can actually kind of, if it takes over too much in the painting, it can change your concerns from painting concerns to photography concerns or cinematic concerns. And for me, the kind of work I'm doing, that just doesn't work in the end, so I have to kind of tame my photo reference in a way.
You went from some dark and pretty gloomy paintings, which were the first I saw of yours, to these, and there's a change, a complete change, which you were just sort of hinting at. Were there things that you saw at some point that made you change into this much brighter world, or?
Not so much things I saw. I just knew if I kept painting dark images, after a while I was just gonna off myself. I went like, Jesus, I'm painting 12 hours a day and I'm painting in hell. You know, I liked the images and I liked looking at them, but it became so intense to live in this dark world every day and to empathize with the characters that I felt like maybe it was sort of, I got something out of my system when I did those. And now there was nowhere to go but up. Like this kind of bleak vision. And another way, like we actually talked about this a little bit with John Seed in his article for the Huffington Post, that came to my mind was I've always been obsessed with Dante's Divine Comedy. So I love the idea of a series of concentric circles, like he designed hell, essentially, or has he designed paradise, or the Purgatorio. And I almost envision this as the outer circle being the darkest, the farthest from the sun. And as you work in, I'm not necessarily doing them in order, but I kind of have almost like an astronomical model in mind that each one will represent a slightly different universe. That, again, as a painter, I can sort of bend the rules of the world, and I can take you to this place where we're in the realm of the hunters, where it's not totally dark. It's not like the series before, where life is struggling just to survive. Life is here. But I think just like going back to the idea of Artemis and the idea of the hunter, there's a cruelty in that. The cruelty that as human beings, we live off of death. There's no denying it. As animals, as creatures, we all live off of death. And it doesn't make us bad. It's not wrong. It's just reality. So I wanted to bring some of that out in here. Not in like a way that I'm condemning human beings and saying you should all be vegetarians, but more like a way that I'm just exploring that aspect of who we are, as opposed to the more innocent, integrated natural, which again, nature's pretty bad. I mean, the horrible things happen. It's just a different psychological state that's represented in the painting.
Brought in my art history class, and we're really getting into a lot of issues about gender and art, and I was wondering if you consider that difference when you're representing a man or a woman in your paintings, especially when kind of taking traditional compositions that are from a time period that have much more traditional views on gender, if you're kind of aware of that and how you're considering that for like a contemporary audience. Yeah,
definitely. I mean, there's quite a few paintings where I've done in the past where I've actually reversed the gender roles. So the first commission I ever did was, I think 23, it was a ceiling painting in a vineyard. And it was this very classical scene, and there was a woman and a man, and personifications of romantic love, really over the top stuff. But I switched it, and I had the man sitting on the woman's lap, which I got away with, which was great. And I think it's actually an interesting thing to do, because so many paintings in the past you see like the shepherdess with the pink nipples and the bronze tanned guy coming after her and carrying her away. And it just honestly didn't really reflect my experience that that's how life works. So even here, I mean, it could maybe with enough drinks or something, but in this case, like she's pointing the way forward, actually. She's got the hand of God, essentially, from the Sistine ceiling, kind of being the destructive force, which is also not usually the normal place that women are put. Women are nice in Western art oftentimes. So she's kind of pointing the way forward, like the reverse creation, which, yeah, I mean, I think absolutely. It's really important because we do still, especially if you're using this kind of imagery, it becomes all the more important to not fall into like historical fallacies or narrow parochial ways of thinking that just happen to come along with the style. Because I'm a firm believer that I don't like iconoclasm. I don't like people, whether they're Byzantines or Protestants, that smash stained glass windows in sculpture, because it's not the sculpture's fault, But I do think that there are ideas that come through that we do sometimes have to separate ourselves from if we're going to be doing work that's inspired by those time periods, because we don't want to bring back all the silly prejudices. We have our own silly prejudices.
What do you do when you get stuck? Do you get
Honestly,
stuck? Doesn't look like it. I mean,
no, I totally get stuck. Actually, when I finished the last series, the Dark series, and I was stuck for a little while. I spent about 2 months where, I mean, to be totally honest, I sat around, I wrote a lot, I took a lot of ideas down, I did smoke a lot of joints, and I just sort of let my imagination go down. Something I heard about Disney once, where they said they would sit in a room and they'd come up with every idea, no matter how bad it was, and nothing would be off the table until the editing process. So I try to do that. I try to say, no editing is going to happen here whatsoever. No idea is too dumb. They're all going in a notebook. No sketch is too ugly. They're all going in a notebook. And then after 2 or 3 months of this, certain ones start to rise to the top, and other ones just turn out to be stinkers, and they kind of get ripped and torn and thrown away. So yeah, I think it's really important. Again, like I was saying, the same thing I think with preparatory work. I think it's really important to give yourself time to let your mind expand beyond its own preconceptions of what a painting can be. Because I don't think it really happens until you go, just as thoroughly as you go into the technique of painting, when you go into the ideas associated with painting, they have a way to kind of like grow and hopefully mature, maybe immature, but either way, you know, bring out more of what you probably actually have to say about the world.
Yeah, I'm curious, when you were 16, did you run away or did you actually have parental support while you were in?
A little of both, a little of both. I actually stopped going to school when I was 14, and it was a public school with a lot of students, so I got away with it for a very long time. And I'd say about 6 months into it, they called my parents and said, your son doesn't go to school anymore. By which point, I'd kind of entrenched myself down my path of just drawing and painting. So at that point, they went along with it. I had been living in a warehouse with some artists for a little while after that too, and it just all kind of came together where fortunately my father was very open-minded, and he said, okay, you can be a painter, but the one thing is you have to be good. So, you know, you better find a school now and actually go learn something, which was fantastic. I mean, I think if it wasn't for that, I probably would have been, you know, wayward youth doing whatever they do.
How many years did it take until you developed the technical facility to be able to paint without limitations?
God, I'm still working on it. I mean, I think it's like this ongoing process of trying to get like closer to the vision that's in here, which is why I think it's so important to talk about all of these devices that I've come up with to share with other painters and students. Because in the end, it's really tough as a painter. You have an image in your mind of what you want to create. And you can be like, okay, great. I'm going to get a model now and I'll pose them. And you're like, no, that looks really stupid. And you're like, okay, great. I'm going to get a photograph and I'm going to take a picture. No, that still looks really stupid. It's like none of it really comes through. And so I'd say it took, I think, 10 to 12 years to get to the point where I had, to my own comfort zone, mastered enough of these like tricks and techniques that I could convincingly pull it off. And also just getting the discipline to overcome the egotistical side of the painter that says, no, I'm just so damn good, I'm gonna walk in and just paint this thing. And then I realized after a while I actually had to discipline myself and that I wasn't quite as good as I thought I was.
A lot of times you go to that computer program, the simulation program.
Yeah,
How does that work?
Well, not very well. Some people are really good at it, and I just gave up on actually using it for anything productive. So, I mean, you saw my kind of scene that I made there. It was just, I don't even know what I was thinking sometimes. I was sticking mushrooms in and tree stumps. And it just, for me, it's more of a way to just kind of think visually. Like, you can cast a light source, which doesn't really work for me because my paintings are not that scientific. It's not like there's one light source, they're in an aquarium, and it's lighting everything. There's a lot of variety for the composition. Some figures will be lighter, some figures will be darker. Some areas get lost in murk and mystery, almost like it's night, and some areas are fully lit like it's in the middle of the day. So all of those things are basically there as aids to let you free your mind to think, which is the hardest thing because it's so easy to have language come in and confound the whole process. You know, where the words try to tell you what you're doing, but in fact, painting fundamentally is still a visual art. So I'm just up for anything that helps you see and think visually, if that makes sense.
The first pass of the paint where you're when you put the wash on and you're building up the whites and stuff like that, I was wondering how thick do you allow the impasto to get on that since you're going to be painting back over top of it again? Like, is that a consideration?
That actually depends a lot. It varies on the piece. I've had a few pieces, like in the front here, you can't really see it very well, but on the rocks, it's pretty thick. Like I'll actually take the crappy leftovers from my palette and I'll knife them on and then paint over them. So I try to keep a level of really high contrast and texture and color contrast in the front and then let it gradually drain out into the back, which again is something that really only happens in nature on if you were to have a cloudy day in the back and a sunny day in the front. So it doesn't really make sense naturalistically, but it just kind of, it reads and it communicates the idea. So yeah, I try to, like, in the front, really kind of build it up sometimes. Not so much on flesh, but on rocks and on trees and on other things of that sort that I can actually, plus it's just really fun to have a palette knife. Yeah.
You said that a lot of your ideas come from old master paintings. Is that the origin of most of your painting ideas, or how did the?
It's a little of
come
both,
to
you know. I think that there's certain structural formulas that I like that the old masters used, such as, again, with this one. If you look at the painting, there's a series of flat planes that tend to overlap and intersect. So it's a very controlled reality, and I find within my vision I can find all kinds of inspiration amongst old paintings. So I'd say about, like, it varies on the painting. I'll jump forward here and show you again one of these collages, which I think kind of talks about it. This was one of my ideas where I was sitting there just playing with visual reference to sort of see where my brain would go. And it's a combination of a Canova statue, a Guido Reni painting, an oil field, somewhere in the Midwest, a cowboy, I think a car wreck, and some dollar bills flying. So in the end, there's definitely an old masterly element that comes into it, but just in the same way that I like the old masters, I like looking for ideas that are playing with the same mythology in like contemporary subjects, such as I think like the oil field is almost like the idea of like El Dorado to me, you know, the city of gold. The cowboys or the gangsters are, I think, the same idea that was going back through the pirates, or probably back through like the raiding bands from, you know, Mesopotamia or something. It's like these ideas of freedom that they represented, and the idea of being outside of the social structure and getting away with it. So it's like half and half, you know? I mean, the two mythologies definitely do intersect, but it's never enough for me to just take an old master idea and be like, ah, that's a good idea, I'll take that. It has to be refiltered through something that hasn't already been done, you know, because they had their own views in the 18th century. Like if you look at this Canova figure down here, the original statue is in this very dramatic position, and he's actually like smashing somebody over his head. I think it's Hercules. And I wasn't really interested in making a piece about somebody smashing somebody over the head, but I did love the kind of dynamic angles that went into it. And so in building this collage, it influenced me when I came to do my painting to push things a little farther, to be like, wow, if Canova had the balls to do it, I'm going to do it too. Even though it's completely weird, you know, like it doesn't make sense realistically, that figure. But that's part of its magic, I think, too. Like it's this archetypal figure of masculinity.
And I was going to say, I thought you should share about the models that you use.
Oh, the models that I use, yeah. Okay. Let me actually bring that up. That's sort of a gallery of painters. So this painting here, this is Martin Whitfoot. This is Billy Norby, who are they both show here in LA with Corey Helford Gallery. This is my girlfriend, Alexandra Pakula, who's a figure painter, or cityscape painter, who shows in New York with Gallery Hinnick. Let me actually go back to the other one. This is actually a jewelry maker of all the rare things. We went to middle school together and high school in Portland, Oregon, and met on the rooftop of our building in Brooklyn. And I've got a couple other pieces, which I'm not finding in here yet, but Jason Yarmosky, who's another fantastic painter, was the model in my most recent painting. So I've been drawing from all of my friends and acquaintances around who are painters, who I respect, to kind of stick them in my painting and hopefully steal a little magic from them.
From your inception of your ideas to you finish a painting, what kind of time frame?
It varies a bit. I'd say for this one, it took me a good 2 months to really come together with the idea for the series. And just practically speaking, I like to work a whole series out together, simply because it's so damn hard. You know, struggling to find the idea that's going to work for me, that I'm going to be satisfied with spending a year on, can be really tough. And it sucks to get halfway through the year and go, oh crap, I've got to do 6 more months of this. So I spend quite a while in the beginning. And then once I have it, throughout that process, because my method is writing, making collages, thinking through, hopefully I've got like at least 10 or 15 sort of inspirations that are ready to go for paintings. You know, sometimes more, sometimes less. So then when it comes to the actual painting, it becomes much more practical. You know, I was kind of remembering a story about Bernini, that he used to have a courtyard, and when he had a great idea, he would go and draw it on the wall. And then when somebody came to him and like, I want a Saint Sebastian, he'd be like, okay, great, and he'd have it, and he'd take it, and he would make it. So I try to do the same thing when I do a series, is just spend a good, focused amount of time where I'm just thinking about ideas and just thinking about vision, and then I'm able to switch over and really focus on just the act of painting for maybe a year when I make the series.
Your writing process, is it more about your ideas about what you're going to do, or is it more about narrative and story about things that are happening?
It's both, actually. It's just about everything. I really, the editing, no editing is totally true. I mean, it'll be memories, it'll be like artsy concepts for the paintings, it'll be very basic narrative concepts, it'll be frustration about how frustrated I am that I'm not getting a concept. It'll really be anything, because I find it's a weird thing. Like, when I did this series, I actually designed intellectually on paper about 7 different series. And in the end, aspects of them came together and other aspects were discarded. So I think I had a whole series of mythological creatures and I had a whole series of hunters that I liked, but somehow each one in and of itself didn't seem to really work. And then when I put them together, I was like, aha, the hunters are hunting these creatures, and it started to add another level of narrative and drama that I could play with in the paintings.
Posing the dead ducks didn't work for you. How did you get your ducks?
Oh, God, okay. I'll actually tell you that story, a ridiculous one. It also made me a confirmed like meat snob, because I went down to get the duck in Bushwick, Brooklyn at this little, I don't know, a slaughterhouse or a duck concentration camp. I don't know what it was, but it was a prison. It's a duck prison is the word I'm looking for. And the ducks were in there, and I swear to God, they were like holding each other down and pecking each other to death. Like, this was like kind of, again, a Hollywood vision of a prison nightmare. So I went in and I kind of plugged my nose and I was like, okay, give me the duck. And they gave me the duck and I took it home. And it was horrible. I opened the bag thinking, I've got this nice, white, beautiful duck that they gently killed for me, and then I'm going to eat it later, being a good guy, which didn't happen. So I took it out, and blood was just pouring all over the place, and it didn't work, and it was terrible. So I didn't even get to eat it. By the time I was done, it started to stink. So I just felt like, I'm an asshole, I'm throwing this duck out, and that's that. But in the end, I finally just went and found images of ducks. And so I would look at different pictures of ducks, and I would design my ducks, and I'd clip a duck from Google and like rework the lighting on it and just do what I had to do. But next time I have a plan, which I'm gonna get a duck, and I'm going to give it some kind of a sedative, and it's gonna live, and then I'm gonna let it go free. So that's my plan next time. I also read that you can hypnotize ducks and chickens with a pencil, so we'll see. I hope so.
Thank you, Adam.
All right, thank you. Thanks.